Hello, I might as well start, since by my watch, and I think that clock, we're at 1 o'clock. Today we want to talk about the proposal to build a commercial nuclear power plant western side of the INL site. And it's something that's been talked about. It's a real proposal. And I want to engage the audience with this possibility. I'm not a spokesman for anyone. I speak only for myself, which means I'm going to speak my mind. And I hope you do too. I'm recording the talk, and everyone who signed up for this via Friends for Learning, I'll send out, once I get it up on YouTube, I'll send it out so you can go and look at it later. My contact information is on the handout. You may or may not be able to read the chalk here. So my email address is Piet, Stephen, with an N there, @hotmail.com. But that's written down on this handout. So ask me questions, and I'll try to get back to you. If I don't know the answer today, I won't make it up. I'll tell you what I know, what I don't know, and try to get an answer to you later. I worked at the site, the INEL, INEEL, and INL for 32 years. I've got all kinds of peer-reviewed papers and book chapters and whatnot. In the 5 years since I've been retired, I have continued to be interested in energy matters. And I've spoken to Friends for Learning on a couple of different subjects over the years. And when we were putting together the proposals for this semester, I said it's time to talk about this reactor proposal. In the course of preparing for this talk, the talk changed. Where I'm going to take you in the next hour and a half is different than what I imagined back when we started this semester. Because we in Idaho Falls, and indeed in Idaho, face more challenges with electricity supply than I imagined. So the first, roughly third of the talk, which I want to go through quickly, sets the stage, the context for why we need more generating capacity. Maybe it's this, maybe it's something else, but we have an issue, we have a problem, we have a challenge. And that motivates my interest in this proposal. So we're going to talk about that challenge. Why it's happening, how it's happening. And I'll give you one example right up front. 30 years ago, after I had lived in Idaho Falls a couple of years, the city got close to generating half of its electricity by its dams along the Snake River. Any guesses as to what fraction of the city's electricity it generates itself nowadays?
A third.
I heard a third. What other?
A quarter.
A quarter is the right answer. So in the last 3 decades, we've dropped from a half to a quarter. What that means is that we are more beholden to what other people do and to our being able to buy what other people generate. We can decide for ourselves whether that's smart or not. So there's a proposal. I'll talk about what the product is, who would own it, and who would sell it to us, benefits and issues. First draft of this talk, I used the phrase renewables to talk about part of the energy options that we and the rest of the world have in front of us. And then I realized, in part because of one of my reviewers' comments, that the term renewable is bogus, because you find it's not technically defined. In fact, different people define it different ways. So I want to set the stage here by saying, well, we got the fossil energy options, and they all have limits on fuel, either near term, centuries from now. They all face a limitation in terms of construction of chromium. When you look at resource limits long term, even if you had infinite supply, you have an issue of how much chromium to build steel. And of course, there's a variety of environmental issues. Then the set of options that I'm going to refer to as distributed, hydro, solar, wind. One of the reasons I don't call them renewables is that sometimes hydro is included in renewables and sometimes it's not. And I'm not going to play that political game. So I'm just going to call it distributed because they're all distributed. They take a lot of land, sometimes a lot of water. They have their own resource limitations. It's not so much a fuel limit, but in the case of wind, you have rare earth elements that have to be used in the modern motors that go into, or generators that go into the wind turbines. And of course, there are a variety of environmental issues there. And today we'll primarily talk about a new way of doing nuclear power. So there'll be a variety of issues that we'll discuss. But these are the options. U.S. electricity. At the high level, we get just under 2/3 of our electricity as a nation from fossil fuels. A little less than 20% nuclear, and everything else is what I call dispersed. This has changed. Over the last 10, 20 years, we've dropped maybe 5% fossil as the dispersed fraction has increased. Breaking it down, fossil is mostly now natural gas with coal in second place. This is a big change over the last 1 or 2 decades. Coal at one time was close to 50% of the nation's electricity. It has really dropped and is going to drop more. You may or may not like that, but that's what's happening. That is a huge change from when I first gave energy talks 15 years ago. Breaking down dispersed, wind has now basically caught up with hydro, a big change. So that 7% wind wasn't there 15, 20 years ago. But the nation is going through a huge change in our sources of electricity. Now let's talk about the state of Idaho. We are energy paupers, and we are surrounded by states that like to sell us electricity. They make profit on us. We have essentially no oil, no natural gas, no coal. We import all of that. We import roughly 1/3 of our electricity, and the components to generate wind, or for that matter, hydro plants, we generally import that type of equipment. We don't build windmills in Idaho, for example. We don't have that industrial capacity. We are beholden on other states. So where does our state generate electricity? 4/5, 81% dispersed. And then 19% fossil. Now that plot does not include what we import from other states. Later on, I'll get to the city of Idaho Falls. So fossil turns out to be mostly natural gas, and dispersed is mostly hydro. So this is where we generate electricity around the state of Idaho. Mostly hydro, natural gas, wind, and then a bunch of small little fractions. Things are going to change. This is a list of just 11 of the coal-fired plants in the West that are going to close in the next 1 or 2 decades. These are generally big plants. You might like it, you may not like it. We don't control it. Again, we're the energy paupers here. Like it or not, that's where we are. And then a biggie, 2028. The city of Idaho Falls gets roughly 60% of our electricity from the Bonneville Power Association, or Administration, BPA. That contract comes up for renewal in 2028. In a time period where there's a whole lot of existing power plants around the West that are going to be closing. BPA is not building new capacity. There aren't no new big hydro dams going up anywhere. Certainly not in our country. Maybe in China, but that's irrelevant to us. So we're going to be negotiating for power while the supply in the West is going down. Furthermore, California is going to continue to dominate and influence us, as well as the rest of the Western grid. Question, Dan?
What's the reason for them shutting down these power plants?
RPS, Renewable Power Supply requirements. So state after state have been passing laws that require utilities by some date to have some fraction carbon free. And I thought about putting a slide with all those dates in there, and they're changing all the time, and decided that was too far afield of my purpose. California has gone, because of wind and to some degree solar, 15 years ago, California was the giant sucking sound in electricity. It would suck in electricity from all over the West. Now it still does that when the wind doesn't blow. Other times, it's a giant blower, and it pushes electricity out to the rest of the Western grid. So it's become an unstabilizing force on the Western electrical grid. And everybody else has to deal with that. And then there's a wild card called dam removal. Who likes to eat or fish salmon? Yeah, that got less of a reaction than I thought it would. Well, there are a variety of proposals to save the salmon. For a long time, there's been a proposal to build or remove the 4 dams on the lower Snake River. Well, that turns out those 4 dams together generate electricity equal to 1.5 times the amount of electricity that would be generated by the proposed nuclear power plant. Put things in a little bit of context. Well, you can tell from the slide, the image there, that there's another 4 dams I haven't mentioned yet. 4 dams on the Columbia, which our friends to the west have been proposing, most recently on October 14th. They want to tear those dams down. That's even more electricity. That's roughly 4 times the electricity that we would generate by the plant to be built outside Idaho Falls.
I know you don't have a crystal ball, but can you give an estimate in years when you think the first dam would be taken down?
I'm not touching that one at all. He asked me what's my prediction of when the first of those 8 dams would get torn down. I'm not going there. It might be never. Who knows? Judges can do anything. So if the proposals occur, that's 5.5 times the electricity would have to be replaced, 5.5 times what we would generate west of Idaho Falls, just to put things into context.
Steve, the 5.5 times the SMR output, is that the output of the modules that UAMPS and Idaho Falls have committed to, or the total. The 12 modules?
Total 12 modules. Now there's another little thing before we get into Idaho Falls, and that is we don't really store a significant amount of electricity. You have to match electricity use to generation. Historically, that's been done worldwide by taking fossil fuel plants up and down as the demand has to be matched to the need. Generation has to be matched. Well, we don't generate electricity by oil significantly anymore, and we're phasing out coal. And there are a lot of people who want to phase out natural gas. And all the other options, there are legal and or technical limits on following the load. Minute by minute, hour by hour, day to day, week to week, season by season. I learned, for example, Friends for Learning, we had a tour of Palisades Reservoir recently, the dam. They can't load follow. Technically they could, they've got the equipment, but they are not legally allowed to because that dam is authorized primarily, number 1, for safety, i.e. prevent floods, and number 2, water supply to farmers. So although they have the technical ability to load follow, they can't. And most of the dams in the West have the same basic restriction. So how we're going to match, as fossil is taken off grid, how are we going to match the change in demand? That's an issue. it's a motivation, in part, for the small modular reactor. I'll get to that later. Well, finally, Idaho Falls. We generate 26% last year of our own electricity. 67%, 2/3, is long-term contracts, and most of that's BPA. And then there's some spot purchases, the last 7%. Now that's ownership. This is the generating source. So this includes both what we generate ourselves and what we buy. 90% is dispersed. We actually use some nuclear electricity in Idaho Falls. I did not really realize that until I put this together. And these numbers that I'm showing you here are going to be on the Idaho Falls Power website, but they're not there yet. Breaking it down even more, so now I've taken dispersed and broken it into pieces. Hydro is still 87% of the electricity we use in Idaho Falls. I did not realize it was that high, given all the wind that we have outside Idaho Falls. Because that 4-part wind farm that we all see outside our city, Idaho Falls Power only owns about 3 megawatts of that. Less than 1% of that huge wind farm comes to us, as does phone call. I didn't realize our ownership was that small. Now breaking down even more. Now breaking it down not only the type of electricity, whether it's coming from oil or coal or hydro or whatever, but whether it's what we own or what we're buying from someone else. So the largest piece of this is hydro contracts. That's BPA. So 60% of our electricity, we are buying long-term contracts, hydro. This is what we, oops. Well, no, it's not going to go there we go. So there's the quarter of the city's electricity that we generate by our own dams along the Snake. And then there's all kinds of little pieces here and there. And our current people in the city, they have to somehow make sense of all this. And this doesn't even deal with matching generation to demand, minute by minute, hour by hour. Those guys, I don't know how much they're paid, but they need more.
Yes.
But we're competitive. I know everyone would like their power bill to go down, but we're in pretty dang good shape. This is a plot across the bottom, the number of customers. There's 17 utilities in the state of Idaho. There are different sizes. Some are really, really tiny. We're kind of medium size. This is the average price versus the number of customers. The red dot is us, Idaho Falls Power. I looked at that when I put that plot together and said, damn, we're good. I wish I could take credit. So, finally we get to the proposal. The owner would be something called UAMPS, and I'll define that for you in a minute. The vendor is a company called NuScale, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission would be the regulator. So what's UAMPS? Utah Associated Municipal Power Systems. It's actually originally a legal creation of the state of Utah. There are 47 members in 6 states, and those members who have signed on board this proposal are part of the Project Management Committee. And we are one of the, Idaho Falls Power is one of the larger components of UAMPS. The blue dots here are the different utilities. So basically it's an I-15 set of municipal utilities when it boils down to it. And then there's some projects in various places up in red. NuScale is a company based outside Portland. They have not built a reactor yet. They are pursuing sales here to Idaho Falls Power and the rest of UAMPS and in Tennessee. And they've got all kinds of marketing and things going on in a variety of countries. My assessment, having looked at this on and off for 15 years at least, There are people, multiple countries around the world that are trying to get into the small modular reactor market. These guys are the farthest out in front. I could be wrong, somebody could scoop me, but I think they're the market leader. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Back, who remembers the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC? No? We are primarily a set of retirees, so that helped contribute to that response. So the AEC was broken into DOE, Department of Energy, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. NRC regulates roughly 100 power plants around the country. The other 100 power plants owned somewhere in the United States or overseas are submarines and floating things called
Targets.
targets, yes, for those of you who are ex-submarine. Yeah, I got that lecture years ago. DOE is not a regulator. It regulates a couple of its own facilities, like the things out here in our own desert. But that's not DOE's business. The NRC is the professional nuclear regulatory agency in the United States. There are 5 commissioners, nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate, and currently about 3,200 employees. Most people in Idaho have not dealt with the NRC before. Instead, we are familiar with the DOE world, where the site, we've got DOE is the owner, DOE and its contractors operate things, DOE is the lead regulator, DOE's contractors sell things to the rest of the site, and all the money for waste, all the money for cleaning up a site afterwards, decommissioning, all come from federal yearly appropriations. So it's a government entity. That's not this proposal. UAMPS, probably a contractor, will be the owner and operator. It's not DOE. The regulatory agency is the NRC, and the vendor is NuScale. So we got a different cast of characters here than those of us who've lived here for a while are used to. Yes, Daniel?
Rick Perry is the Secretary of Energy. Is he in charge of the DOE or the NRC?
DOE.
So he's a very small thing.
Rick Perry is currently the DOE Secretary. I understand he's leaving at the end of the year. I don't happen to remember who the chair of the NRC is. I used to know that, but maybe someone knows. But anyway, there's 5, which means DOE secretaries come and go, but the NRC has a slow evolution in its 5 commissioners because they don't come up for renomination or replacement.
So the decommissioning of nuclear warheads now that was done by the NRC?
For warheads, that's DOE.
Oh, that's DOE. Okay.
But if commercial nuclear power, commercial regulation of hospital waste and so forth, that's all NRC. And instead of yearly federal appropriations, the money for waste management and the money for decommissioning the plant 40 or 60 years from now will come from the money generated during the course of the reactor operation. It's not tied to the federal appropriation process at all. Waste management, there's a yearly fee that goes in that someday the federal government may or may not do anything about it. And for decommissioning, there is a trust fund that is set up in the state of each power plant. And strangely enough, state legislators have tried to go and steal that money in other states, South Carolina and California. And they're set up in trusts so that the states that have tried that have failed. So the money is indeed locked away. Grading pellet. Take a look at your finger up to your first joint. Okay, that, depending on the size of your hand, that's roughly the energy equivalent of a ton of coal. So that's how concentrated nuclear power is. It means we have to handle it carefully. So there's a lot of power in your finger. Yeah, if it's made out of uranium oxide. So you take uranium oxide, yellow and pure, make it into pellets, put it into fuel cylinders, fuel rods. They go into boxes, and then the final picture is the Columbia Nuclear Power Station, and that's in Washington State. That's the closest current power plant to Idaho Falls. So what's NuScale? NuScale, there would be 12 of these modules. Well, this is the fuel, reactor core. And then right here is what's called the pressure vessel, reactor pressure vessel. And then this whole thing is the containment. Now, small modular reactor, we're trying to learn from decades of pressurized water reactor experience. Use the reactor technology, but use it in new ways. And I'm reminded of a quote, 1995, Henry Petrosky. Technology evolves in response to the failings of technology. It was a fascinating article. If you ever want to look up a fun article about paper clips, look up this article. It's fascinating. It talked about the evolution of paper clips. I, for one, found it fascinating. So, we have factory-built modules instead of a lot of on-site construction. The hope is that that will save money. Construct an on-site pool, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, versus a containment dome. And I'll show what that means. And you shrink the volume that has to contend with high pressure in accidents. And that ends up saving money. The smaller the volume, the less you have to worry about certain things. So this is a size comparison. Over here, to scale, is one of these modules, which includes its containment. On the right is a typical PWR. There's the reactor vessel, which I showed you before is inside here. And in this whole monster is the containment dome. Those suckers are expensive. So you have a reactor down here. It sits inside its reactor vessel, which sits inside a containment. It's inside of a pool that has water around it. There are no active pumps inside the reactor vessel. Everything is done by natural circulation. Therefore, there's nothing called a pump that can fail. There's heat rejection and therefore pumps to make electricity by taking water and letting it flash to steam, turn a turbine, and eventually get electricity. So out here, NuScale doesn't look much different than anything we've built before. So there's no emergency pumps, no emergency coolant systems, because it's just natural convection, natural buoyancy. And surrounded water with water pipes, with more water, so the issues of loss of cooling are reduced, if not eliminated. And the whole thing is put below ground, below grade, to improve the resilience against earthquakes and seismic events, hurricanes, which we don't have in Idaho, thank God. I say that as someone who grew up in North Carolina, so hurricanes mean something to me. Floods, aircraft impact, all this is reduced. So I mentioned this is in a pool, so here's the reactor vessel, containment, a pool of water. This is the ground level, and then a reactor building. So there's a biological shield, which is moved when they have to get in and move things around. They've done a lot of homework. They have tested these components, how well they can be made. There's tests that have been done in Oregon, Washington, Canada, Italy, Germany, and France, which I don't have time to get into. There's a lot of testing that's been done. So this is a cutaway view of what the facility would look like. These are 5 of what would be 12 modules. And when a module needs to be opened up and refueled, it's moved. So there's a refueling machine over here, moves around. Spent fuel is left in this big pool for up to 5 years and then moved to dry storage. This is looking down at it. This has to be constructed on site. You don't put this in a shipping container and move it across the country. So some numbers, and again, this whole talk will be on YouTube. So you can come back and look at these numbers later. So there's 12 modules, 60 megawatt each at 720 megawatts gross, but some power is used to run the facility, so it's 684 is the net electricity. Reactor vessel size, the key thing is that the containment vessel is 15 feet in diameter, that thin thing that I showed you before, versus typically 100-foot diameter big containment dome, if not larger. Water circulation versus pumps, it's water lines surrounded by more water lines, low grade, and the plant site boundary would be the emergency planning zone. Instead of a minimum of 10-mile radius. That will make it easier to get permission, means the public is not affected. Some of the things that they're working on, NuScale, is by having a set of modules, you don't take the whole plant offline to refuel, do it one at a time. You can talk about load following a bit easier than in a single large power plant. How well that can be done, we'll have to see. There are studies and processes looking at generating hydrogen fuel from some of the modules. Here they would build all 12. In other markets you might build only one. And an example is years ago, there were 3 of us who did some consulting work for the province of Alberta. And there was a proposal to build a 1,200 megawatt power plant in northern Alberta province because of all the oil shale, and they needed a bunch of heat and so forth to power. Well, the largest power plant in Alberta at the time was 450 megawatts, and Alberta is basically isolated from the other provinces and from the United States. So if you build a 1,200 megawatt plant, when the largest plant in this province already was only 450, you have a very unstable grid. Question over here.
How often do they refuel?
Every year and a half, you move 1/3 of the core out, shuffle it around, bring another third in. So this reactor would have the same fueling system as or cycle as a regular PWR. So there's talk about marketing individual modules for markets where you can't build even 720 megawatts. And they're looking at designs, same technology, but even smaller. This is a hard-to-read map of where the power plants, nuclear power plants are in the United States. Now, we at the INL are here, and we're about as far as you can get from a commercial nuclear power plant and still be in the 48 states. And yet, we're the lead nuclear laboratory. Never quite understood that. This proposal would have the benefit of, I think, metaphorically establishing or reestablishing the E, the engineering word, to the INL. I know there's no proposal to change the name again, and we might have to shoot a politician that wanted to change the name yet another time. But to me, this would make the site more real, more practical engineering. I think you'd see a lot of fun collaborations, the site, ISU's nuclear engineering program, and other engineering programs. CEI and its welding program, for example, you'd have a lot of welders that would be employed at this place. So I think this would be good for the lab. Indeed, one of the 12 modules would be used by DOE for research, and it complements and supports other things that are coming here or might come here. There's a Boise State, Idaho State report done earlier this year, and these are their numbers of the jobs during construction and during the 40 to 60 years of operation, taxes and so forth. So it's a big enterprise, financial. Now, what would it do to Idaho Falls Power? Now, these little graphs ignore the fact that in recent years, the city has grown at 1.8% per year, electricity growth. So that's not included here. So right now, we generate 26% of our electricity last year. We are committed, we the city are committed right now to buying 10 megawatts, and that would increase 26% to roughly 35%. There's an option 5 years later to pick up another 4.8 megawatts, and that would, under the same calculation ground rules, take us to 39%. So we still wouldn't be back to the half of the generation that we used to do as a city. But it would be a step in taking back a little bit of ownership ourselves. So some issues. That first 10 megawatts would represent roughly 9% of the electricity generated by Idaho Falls Power, or used rather by Idaho Falls Power. So its cost is significant, but it won't dominate the cost of our power bills. Right now, we buy power from Bonneville Power Administration at 38 megawatt year hour. And NuScale is constrained contractually to 55. So that would be to the extent that we're replacing BPA, that's an increase of that fraction of our city's electricity. 1 second, Karen. But that's what BPA charges us under the current contract. What happens in 2028 when we are bidding against everybody else in a changing market? Maybe somebody knows what we might have to pay in 2028, but I don't. So it's a changing world. Kurt?
$55 a megawatt hour is one of the talking points that UAMPS and NuScale have used to actually start about 65. To convince investors, municipalities up and down the I-15 corridor, New Mexico, Nevada, California, to invest in this option contract. Idaho Power, which is a corporation out of Boise, has the small modular reactor NuScale going for $125 a megawatt hour predicting, which is a metric. Can you address that or explain the differences?
Did everyone hear Kurt? First off. So there's a talking point, and what's in paper or on paper now is that if we can get power for $55 per megawatt hour, we buy it. If it's above that, our contract with NuScale goes away. We have the right to walk away. And there's Idaho Power, not Idaho Falls Power, say they've assessed the future generation cost at twice this.
At 125 megawatts an hour in their 2019 IRP, which is their integrated resource plan. Commercial utilities have shareholders, board of directors. They go through and predict costs.
Yep.
Okay, for all their different electrical generation resources. And they're predicting $125 a megawatt hour.
So what Kurt's referring to is that Idaho Power, as well as other utilities, they have to do an estimate of what the options they see are and what their estimate of that cost is. And it would be nice if you send me a reference to that, then I can send it out to everybody else.
I will send it to you, but it is on the website, the Facebook that I posted to the director.
Got it.
I've been in communication with him asking questions about costs.
John?
I think that's a fairly common estimate of those companies that look at the levelized cost of energy over the life cycle of the energy source. And most of those that I've seen have been in 120, maybe even up to 150. And from what I can judge, most of that is based on the experience with current large nuclear reactors.
This actually is not large. If you go to the RFP, and I think you have copies to it.
Right.
Nice to meet you face to face. We talk a lot on Facebook and a lot on LinkedIn. That $125 megawatt hour is actually in their IRP, and it mentions NuScale, and it's an SMR. It's not a large reactor, it's a small modular reactor.
Okay.
Even if you assume financing, municipality versus corporations, and subtract $25, you're still at $100 megawatt hour. So I think that's something, given that I'm a ratepayer, and the city council has made a decision to invest in this, and I'm gonna be paying for it, I'd like to know the answer.
My personal reaction is that if that prediction is borne out, the plant will never be built. I mean, if as we get close to the decision point, which I'll get to in a minute, personal prediction is if that's what it still looks, if would-be investors are convinced that that's about the right number in a few years, the proposal will die right then. I mean, I can't speak for anybody else, and sometimes even that's questionable.
Do you have any information on the conversion cost of coal to natural gas?
Question is whether I have any information on the cost of converting a coal-fired plant to a natural gas plant. The answer is no, and it depends on a whole lot of details. That has been done. There's at least one of the coal plants in the west, and I forget which one, where that is the plan. It depends on a whole lot of details of how the plant was built and so forth. But it's, you know, power plants are big. The balancing plant where you have the steam generator and so forth, that shouldn't have to change, at least not change too much. But the boiler itself has to be ripped out and changed. But I don't know any details of the cost. So this is clearly a big issue, which is why I put it first among the issues. Licensing, Nuclear Regulatory Commission used to have an even stranger licensing process than it does now. Now there's two parallel paths, the design and the site. Design certification, there's 4 phases, and for this design they've completed 3 of the 4 phases. As of last report, they're 6 weeks ahead of schedule on the class phase. The published schedule is for this to be completed by September next year. We'll see if that happens. The NRC is not known for being on time on almost anything. Site certification, one of the advantages, one of the reasons to build it within the INL boundaries, it's a well-characterized site. So there shouldn't be any surprises along those lines. But this is a modified technology. And you never know for sure what will get through regulatory approval until it does. Timescale. July 12th, it was announced that there were commitments for 150 of the 684 megawatt electric. And if you add the fact that DOE, for a certain period of time, is in the process of contracting for one of the modules, that would make the amount of electricity, if you will, spoken for up to 210. Logan, I believe, Logan, Utah is the largest investor in this sense. We're probably pretty close to the top, but I don't know all those numbers. They're not public. So design certification, hopefully next year. The acronym COLA stands for Combined License Application, would go to the NRC in August of 21. The hope is that NRC would approve that roughly 2 years later. That's when the decision, rubber meets the road. So Idaho Falls and the other partners, this is the final right to exit versus proceed to construct. That's when things really come to a head. Yes, Gert?
You bring up a very important point here with the subscription, 150 megawatts. And I just want to correct you on something. We just recently changed. Logan was a 30 megawatt subscription. They just dropped down to 5 megawatt subscription. But the concern is, again, the cost. And if they got a 684, let's call it 720 megawatt, they got to say, let's go with 684 because the INL is going to, or the DOE is going to buy some, supposedly. And then we got 150 megawatts subscription. My understanding on that cost of 55 is based on a 684, 720 megawatts. So again, here we are selling a product on the open market to investors for $55. Yet, again, I haven't seen NuScale's calculations. I've asked for them. They only got 150 megawatts sold. So what's that going to do to costs?
So the question, how many could hear this? So it's an important, long question, which I'll break it into pieces. Number one, how real are any of the cost estimates when we don't even know if we can sell all 12 modules worth? Because we don't have buyers. I say we in the broad sense. We don't have buyers for 12 modules worth of electricity. What you didn't ask, but what I have wondered is, if it comes to 2023 and we have the crunch time, and this is the situation then, does that mean we proceed to construct with a third of the modules instead of all 12? That would change the economics, because part of the plant cost is by module and part of the plant cost is for the whole thing. And you only build that pool once, for example. So how that works, I don't know. Cost is like any other power plant. Cost is going to be a go, no-go. I had not heard that Logan had dropped from 30, you said, to 5.
megawatts to 5. The mayor was very uncomfortable with the risks involved for the time, and it's in the Post Register. You can Google it, it's available online.
Prediction, personal prediction, is when, if indeed the NRC gives design certification next year, that will create some momentum. Then you've got a product that's gotten through regulatory approval. In theory, the COLA, combined operating license, ought to be relatively straightforward at that point. So if the design certification comes in, that will make the regulatory roadblock look like it's under control. Then cost will be the dominant set of issues, and we'll see how real the cost estimates look to potential investors, both this city as well as Logan, as well as others, as well as what's the competition. That whole 55 megawatt hour number that I gave before, that's an assessed value based on what people think a new natural gas power plant could sell electricity to us for. Well, that supposes A, that number is real, and B, somebody's actually going to build another natural gas fired power plant. Well, you're not going to build it in Washington State. You're not going to build it in Oregon. You're not going to build it in California. Because all those states are basically on record is they're not going to have new fossil generation in those states. Yeah, there's a bunch of words, but that's what it seems to me. C wants power. Where is it going to get power? What are the alternatives? And by 2028, we better come up with something. First module, 2026, all 12 modules shortly thereafter. That's the plan. Plans change. I've never seen a plan like this get done faster than what's on paper. Waste. I put out a question, set of questions to those people who signed up and said, well, what would you like to be addressed today? Well, waste management is an obvious one. Operating waste, that's something that's well understood. We know this technology. It'll be similar or less in quantity to a current PWR of the same power. The cost is built into the cost estimate. It's low-level waste. It's suitable for what's called near surface burial by a regulation called 10 CFR 61. It's Code of Federal Regulations. And we, in Idaho, we are in what's known as the Northwest Operating or Waste Management Compact. And there's an operating waste management site. It's U.S. Ecology. It's Richland, Washington. So the operating waste will go there. It's not a DOE waste. It's not going to a DOE facility. This place, for operating waste, that's where the stuff would go. Used fuel is the other main category of waste. We know this type of material. There are, I forget how many hundreds of these types of reactors, different size, different details, but the fuel is used in hundreds of reactors around the world. We understand it. We understand what that will do as waste. The one difference is that the fuel rods are half the length, half the height of a typical PWR. And unlike, depending on Congress and the President, to give us money for waste management, here you put money aside year. It's going into a government trust fund, unfortunately. And we'll see what the nation eventually does, but it is, the facility is being designed and costed so that material, used fuel, would be stored there on site for at least 60 years. In other words, all the used fuel generated over the type of the space of the reactor until either recycle happens or there's a disposal site put into operation. This is what storage, dry storage casks look like. The ones that would be at our site would be probably half the height of this, so it's somewhat smaller. And recycle is a possibility. I gave a Friends for Learning talk on recycle of used fuel 4 years ago. 95% of used fuel is usable material, uranium and some transuranics. The other 5% is really waste. That material is, that usable material is a lot of energy. Depending on how you use it, what type of reactor, I won't walk you through all those numbers. There is a lot of energy in used fuel if you take it apart and recycle it. And if you recycle it, you simplify the waste management problem. Because what you're trying to do at, say, Yucca Mountain, the closest the U.S. has to an approach to used fuel now, is to take it and put it in deep geological burial at a site such as Yucca Mountain in Nevada. That means you're taking all the material, low and high heat, low and long-term radioactivity, put it all in the same place, same time. If you break it into pieces, the problem changes. You have material, low heat, low duration. That qualifies for near surface burial. That could go to Richland, Washington, just like the operating waste. You have high heat material for low duration. That would be similar to what's put in the bin sets out of the INL. Now, that's different material, but it's the same radiological characteristic. So you store the high heat for a relatively short period of time. Then there's technetium and iodine, not generating much heat, long-term problem, put that in salt. And then the other material, the actinides, as they're called, that's the material you would recycle.
What kind of enrichment are they thinking about?
Same
Like
as
commercial
Bonneville,
enrichment?
a bit under 5%. The fuel cycle is the same.
They're not considering 19.75% at this point?
Not to my knowledge. There's no commercial reactor in the U.S. that is anything like that. They're all constrained to 5%.
So there's a thrust of the INL
To look at
develop the EBR2 fuel of 19.75%, as well as we have new technology for recovering an heavy fuel that can be used for
Yes.
that.
Now, there's all kinds of different fuel cycles, but NuScale's focus in the engineering and marketplace is on reducing cost, shrinking the size, and so forth. They're letting other people deal with fuel cycle questions. If there was some great big improvement in fuel materials and whatnot, you know, they could adopt it like anywhere else. The physics is not much different. So what I've got here is the radioactivity, or radiotoxicity rather, orders of magnitude, up and down on the left, with one being the radiotoxicity of the original uranium ore that you dug up to do all this. And then across the bottom is years after the material comes out of a reactor. So it's called a log-log plot. So material comes out, it's really radiotoxic. Over time, it decays. Radioactivity decays. Well, that whole profile is what happens if you don't take the fuel apart. If you do take it apart, in those 4 categories that I mentioned before, this is what happens. The material that you would recycle, here in this kind of light blue, instead of a million-year problem, by recycling, you take it down to a 1,000-year problem. The details, of course, will shift the numbers left and right. The isotopes, cesium and strontium, that generate a lot of heat are here. That's a relatively short period of time. We got some long-term stuff, technetium and iodine, and then everything else here in the dark blue. The technologies exist to do that, but they cost money, and we have all kinds of issues. If you want to know more about that issue, you can go back to the talk I gave 4 years ago, and it's one of the things on the handout. So there are things that can be done, but we don't have the political will. Decommissioning any power plant, in fact, anything we build, your house, strip mall down the street, someday ends its economic life. So what do you do with it? Well, unlike DOE facilities, which we've been arguing about for decades out at the site, unlike all other energy technology, unlike any other facility we build in this country, commercial nuclear power plants pay into state-regulated trust funds. Federal government has nothing to do with it, other than set the rules. But the trust funds are established, so every kilowatt hour that is produced, money goes in to eventually decommission the plant. We've got operating real experience in decommissioning plants, and the NRC changes the rules as they get more experience. So we know how to do this. So it's not like all the cleanup issues that we've had at the site for as long as I've been here, 35, 37 years. This would be decommissioned by putting money aside over time. The settlement agreement, one of the questions that has come up is the settlement agreement. How many people are familiar with the settlement agreement, what we're talking about? Okay, it's an agreement, U.S. government, state of Idaho, and Navy. It sets deadlines and milestones for cleaning up mostly Cold War era waste. And if not met, which is the current situation, Idaho can prevent DOE from bringing additional government-owned waste, nuclear fuel, to the site for research or storage. So over the last year or so, the Attorney General has used that authority to block bringing waste in for certain types of research at the INL, and that's been a big political football. In this case, it's not a DOE facility. It's UAMPS. It would be a public utility, or consortium of utilities would own the fuel, not DOE. And it's generated here. It's not being brought in. So both I and what was another group partnered for science and technology a couple years ago, settlement agreement just doesn't look like it applies. I am 100% sure this would go to court. Yes, Gary?
I appreciate you address this, because you're the first one that has publicly addressed this, other than the Snake River Alliance asking the Line Commission. I think it's a very, very important thing to keep in mind. And you mentioned your comment about going to litigation. I'm not a lawyer. I spent 20 years in the Navy nuclear power program, operating their power plants out here on the desert and on subs and shipyards. But I can tell you what I've read and educated myself on the history of the commercial nuclear industry. We're going to be very careful that our leadership at UAMPS, our representative, and our city council does not put the ratepayers in between the state of Idaho and environmental groups during litigation. So when that happens, we're no longer going to be paying X number of dollars. It's going to double, triple. Read your history books. So I caution ratepayers in the room, pay close attention to what goes on in the settlement agreement. I'm not a lawyer, but you know how it works in litigation. I'm not anti-environmental groups, okay? I'm an advocate for nuclear, although I speak up. That's what I was taught. But not to steal the thunder, Steve, but I think this is a very important point that the Line Commission has avoided. They were asked this by a Snake River Alliance representative, and a lot of people, including the director of Idaho Falls Power, has avoided. So I'll leave it at that.
Kurt's bringing up what I would call is legal risk, which I've been thinking a little clearer. I would have added as a slide all by itself. If you look over the last 40 years, how have nuclear power plant projects been defeated? And the answer is lawsuits. I was a student and a grad student at MIT, Boston, and I watched from that fairly short distance the battles for years over the Seabrook plant. They didn't have our alliance here. It was the Clamshell Alliance back there. The plant eventually opens, it's generating power, big success. The lawsuits went on and on and on. This is undoubtedly an area that will have lawsuits to it. And the state of Idaho, if I'm right, the state of Idaho will have to decide its interpretation of the settlement agreement. So when the alliance goes after the project and claim that it's a violation of the settlement agreement, the state of Idaho will then have to go on record Does it agree with this interpretation or that interpretation? That's, who knows? I mean, I can't predict politicians.
Thanks for bringing it up, because I've asked this question to our leadership, including the director of Idaho Falls Power, and continue to ignore it. And the Snake River Line's representative asked the Simplifies Line Commission. They've been ignored.
I'm a safety engineer.
What is this position in between a litigation between the state of Idaho and other organizations of our members?
Most of my career, I've been a safety engineer, and people who worked with me in that time period will confirm. I'll ask tough questions. I'll stand up to anybody, anytime, anywhere, if I have a question. And this is a question, this is an issue. I think the interpretation is pretty clear, but I'm no lawyer.
I agree.
So it sounds like you're saying that the fuel will be stored here,
That's the plan.
not gonna go anywhere, unless it's recycled or reprocessed.
Or
And
disposed.
There are, as I understand, there are no reprocessing plants running now, is that correct?
Not in this country.
Okay.
There
And
certainly
so
are elsewhere.
If they do reprocess, then the high-level waste will also be stored.
No, you would, again, depending on which, there's a variety of approaches to recycling used fuel. Depending on exactly how you do that, then you've got a couple of different waste streams, as I tried to outline before, and you do different things with those. Because they have
Yucca
different
Mountain is
characteristics.
open, was it?
I'm sorry?
Yucca Mountain is not open?
No, sir.
And
No, sir.
probably won't.
I've walked through there. Personal engineering assessment. Yucca Mountain is over-designed. It is too expensive. The titanium drip shields, for those of you who know what that is just kind of nuts. I think it's too expensive because it was over-designed, personal opinion. But if you take the fuel apart, you then have precedents for what to do with the different types of waste, which we don't have now. Because nobody in the world has a deep geological disposal site in operation. There's a variety of projects in different places, but none in operation. If you take it apart, then there are operating precedents in this country and elsewhere for the different types of waste. So that's one, to me, one of the motivations.
Not to beat a dead horse, but if you're gonna put this online or send it out, I recommend that you modify the settlement agreement does not apply, somehow may apply, however you wanna put it, but make a blatant statement, again, you're not a lawyer, neither am I.
And-
To say that kind of sets you up, and could be, and quite frankly, is misleading.
Well,
But
that's my opinion.
It's your presentation.
It's my presentation, my opinion. I think the English language actually applies in this case, but I'm sure lawyers will get at it,
I'm gonna read the lawyer.
which is why it's on the board. Water! Partnership for Science and Technology had a FAQ 2 years ago. Then it was the proposal was a 600 megawatt facility. I just scaled the numbers to 720. If there are wet cooling towers, which is a normal way to take heat rejection and thermodynamics, so you have water, it evaporates to the atmosphere to make the whole cooling system work, roughly 6 million gallons a day consumed. That's, according to that FAQ, that's equivalent to basically 4 large center pivot irrigation systems. I don't know those numbers. UAMPS is pursuing private water rights, and as Idaho Falls Power Manager Bear Prairie said at August, I think it was, when he gave a presentation, they are considering instead using dry cooling tower where the water usage would drop considerably. You had a question?
You mentioned earlier that Idaho's about as far away as possible from any nuclear generating facility.
Today.
In my opinion, this is why we're in a high desert. We don't have a lot of water, and we don't have big rivers, and this is why.
So
The power generation plants are not here.
The comment is that one of the reasons, maybe I forget, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Would you say the reason we don't have a nuclear power plant here?
A big reason.
A big reason we don't have one here now is water.
Cool.
And indeed, some years, 15, 20 years ago, there were proposals to build natural gas plants in northern Idaho, and they were killed by lack of water rights and whatnot. There's a proposal to build a coal plant somewhere in southern Idaho, I forget where, and again, it died from lack of access to water. So that's why the slide's here. It's an issue. The fact that they are serious consideration of dry cooling tower, to me, I don't know the current numbers, but that costs money. So going back to the cost estimate, if you go from wet to dry cooling towers, the technology exists, but it costs you money. Yes, Dan?
So whether it's wet cooling tower or a dry cooling tower, the heat is rejected into the atmosphere, is that right?
Yes. Yes. The ultimate heat sink is the atmosphere. It's just how effective or efficient is that heat rejection that must occur. And evaporation of water is a very effective way of rejecting heat, moving heat, but it means you're pushing water into the atmosphere. And, you know, you'd see the water vapor, particularly on a cold winter
So,
day.
so one of the claims that was made by the larger reactors was efficiency. So what is the efficiency of these reactors? Is it more like 50% or?
It should be the same as a PWR, current PWR, and I don't happen to have those numbers in my head.
Even though it's much smaller?
The efficiency is driven by the steam generators and the temperature of the output water, and I know of no reason why the output and inlet temperatures would be any different. Should work the same. I haven't validated that, but it should be the same.
The Rankine efficiency for the steam plant is about 19%. And I don't know how much better this is the nuclear plant.
I don't have those numbers in my head. I used to, but I've gotten too old. So, personal opinion, dry cooling towers, if that's an option, means, to me, that means that, you know, they're owning up to your comment about water. Of course, there are large generating plants in Utah and Wyoming, and they're dry states just like we are. So other places have managed to do this.
Well, your slide showed nothing in Wyoming, nothing in.
Well, those are nuclear power plants. But the water usage of this plant per megawatt is insignificant difference from coal or anything else. It's the fact that you got heat rejection, and whether you're generating the heat this way or that way, it makes a little bit of difference down in the details, but not much. So if I can put a 1,000 megawatt plant that happens to be coal in some place in Wyoming, that means from this perspective, I could do the same thing and generate it from nuclear power instead of coal or natural gas. So the heat rejection is roughly the same. So I think the proposal would help meet the needs of Idaho Falls Power. The technology, I think, is there. I think regulatory risk is, it's there. There's first of a kind risk. The economics is a question mark. I think it looks pretty promising. I was unaware of the Idaho Power assessment that you mentioned, Kurt.
Which Idaho Power assessment?
The one where you said that was $125 per megawatt hour.
Once you have the link, I sent it,
Yeah.
and it's on the Better Prairie has it, but I'll send it to you again.
But that's, you know, economics can kill any power plant proposal. Water can kill any power plant proposal in this part of the country. And then legal regulatory delays and whatnot can kill any power plant. So those are at least three things that can derail all this.
I hate to keep asking questions and making comments, but I think you've done a great job. But economics, can you talk a little bit about the history of the commercial nuclear industry? Some of the recent large commercial nuclear power plants? Not put you on the spot, but
The question was asking me to give a whole new talk, just in case you hadn't heard my voice long enough this afternoon, on the history of nuclear power and its financial and economic prospect. One of my former roommates, Dave Petty, has led a very detailed study, which I have not adequately digested. So I can only make a couple of broad comments because economics is not my specialty. Safety is. I claim to know safety. Economics, my assessment is the technology in the 60s grew too far too fast. There's too much scale up of the technology before there was adequate operating experience. People got in over their heads. Utilities that did not know what they were doing decided that this was the up-and-coming thing, and we're gonna jump in and, oh my God, what the hell is this that we just bought, and we know how to operate it? Personal assessment. That coupled with opposition to nuclear power, which took advantage of legal regulatory matters and really fouled things up. The cost of Seabrook, for example, more than doubled just by delays. You can kill any project, almost any technology, by delaying it long enough. That's just the legal reality we live in this country. I don't care what it is. Roughly the same strategy can use. I think all those problems have been understood. They have been addressed. Some years ago, I was in Vienna and happened to have the opportunity to be present with presentations on what we would today call SMRs and how people were assessing economics and safety and so forth, not just this proposal, but other proposals from around the world. And people think they understand what has happened. I'm no expert on it, so it sounds good, but I'm no expert.
I'm not an expert, I'm an engineer, but if you look at most recently, DC Summer, South Carolina, okay, billions of dollars in cost overruns behind schedule, utility cancels it, the ratepayers got stuck with paying for the partial construction. Local, right now is on life support, and it's got so many subsidies trying to get that thing through, and Westinghouse went bankrupt trying to get these projects done. So it's just not the 60s and 70s. We don't have trained welders, trained electricians, managers, read the I think it's the VCA Bechtel report. But I think it's important to bring that up, because this is just 3 or 4 years ago.
Kurt's raising, good question, there are plants, not just the United States, not just the examples you give, but certainly the ones in Europe have run into economic trouble. Managing a large construction project of any type is a challenge in the legal regulatory world that the US, Europe, not so much Asia, lives in. Getting any project to completion, I don't care what it is not easy and not for the faint at heart. Which comes back full circle to where I started. We want electricity. I need electricity to live the life I want to live here in Idaho Falls. Where is it going to come from? There are issues with this proposal. We've discussed it today, and we've got some time to continue to discuss. We'll see how things play out. I'll pass on the questions in this video to those who might be able to do something about it. But the alternative is not to do nothing. We must do something. I don't know for sure. I think this is part of the solution. I call it on. It might prove not to be for one of a collection of reasons we've talked about. But we got to have an answer. And I'll come full circle. We vote on city council today. Well, unfortunately, to the extent that there was a political debate in this city, it was about things like the cost of signs around the city, which frankly I don't give a damn. I wish we had local politicians that would address this issue. Where the hell is electricity in Idaho Falls going to come from? Why do we generate 26% of our electricity, whereas 3 decades ago it was close to half? How did that happen, and what are we going to do about it? That personal opinion. I think this is part of the answer. It's not all the answer. I don't think. We need to be doing other things in addition to this. Daniel.
I think the difference between the 60s and 70s and today is that we no longer have the luxury of being able to swap out one source of power for another. We need electricity whether we like it or not. That's part of our lifestyle. And we will go back into prehistory if we don't have electricity. And when you put the switch on, the light does not come on. So the question to me is not so much the economic risk, because whether we like it or not, we are going to have to face that risk. And we can't just shove it out to another day, is the way I look at it.
I tend to agree with that. Other comment here.
Some time ago, maybe over a year ago, there was a press release about a power plant proposal just off the INL on the northwest side. Do you have any recollection of that, what that might have been about?
The question was earlier proposal Other than this? Yeah, this has been talked about for years.
Not this, something different.
John, do you know?
Just vaguely, I haven't heard anything about it. The last I heard, which is, I don't know, 4 years ago or so, that they had options on land just near Howe, I think it was. And they had, they were working on the water rights, but that's as far as it got, as far as I know. It was mostly talk. The organization may still be in existence.
I don't have to remember.
Bob Skinner was involved in it.
Other questions?
Since you're the safety guy, what kind of safety issues are there concerning what the nuclear reactor may have to our aquifer? And doesn't it set fairly close to the main part of the aquifer out there in the site, on the site? How is this reactor less prone to being affected by earthquakes? Because that's one of our local things. And what kind of climate change is there? Would it be any kind of a measurable effect really from the cooling towers and both release of the heat and of the?
Long question, I'll try to address it in parts. One part, Bob, I know you know the answer better than I. How far above the aquifer is 20, 30 feet below ground level? How far down is the aquifer?
It's a little over 500 feet.
Okay, so we're almost a mile above the aquifer, which water still percolates. This is exceedingly safe. You don't have to depend on active pumps. You have water surrounded by water surrounded by water surrounded by big, thick concrete walls. That's not going anywhere. There's material, videos, and so forth, calculations, as well as tests that show all these things work in a variety of off-normal conditions, work in the sense of generating or rejecting the heat. I don't see significant risk. Is there a zero risk? Well, as a safety engineer, I'll tell you that nothing is zero risk. No such animal. Climate change by putting water vapor into the air if it's a wet cooling tower, that's small compared, well, first off, you're going to generate power somewhere, and you're going to be rejecting heat somewhere. Even if it's wind, you're still rejecting heat in the process of the equipment necessary to build the turbines in the first place. So from an overall perspective, you're using energy in all of these cases to make electricity. Let's see, what else did you ask me there? So safety-wise, I'd live next to it. Zero hesitancy on my part. I would live right next door to this thing, particularly if they bought me a new house. But to be serious, when I was a grad student, I lived or worked as a grad student, therefore I lived in my office. It was in the same building as the MIT research reactor. It didn't bother me then. Being next door to this wouldn't bother me now. It wouldn't bother me that my family, my kids, my granddaughter were there. I'm not worried about that. And before any radioactivity could ever get into the environment, all kinds of bizarre things would have to go wrong, all of which have been anticipated. I think they've done their homework, and that's what the NRC is checking. That's why we're at phase 3 instead of phase 4. That's what design certification is all about. I don't know if I can allay all your concerns, and they're obvious and serious and appropriate concerns. That'll be debated, and we'll see how design certification comes out.
Will this have much impact on electric cars? Like, we had electric cars, and the idea was, well, maybe Idaho Falls would take all electric cars. So we were wondering, where's the power going to come from to drive all these electric cars? So is this a solution for that, or are we going to get that electric power somewhere else?
It's been years since I've looked at how electric powered cars, which I hope my next one will be, influence all this business. One of the unknowns is what time of day are people primarily going to be recharging their cars? To the extent that they charge them at night, and it's a grid dominated by wind or solar, you're making the problem worse. To the extent they're regenerating batteries, recharging batteries during the day, you make the problem actually a little easier because you level out the load. People are going to do some of both. And I'm sure people have looked at those details, and I certainly don't know what they are. Dan?
Is it possible that the forecast for increased need assumes more use of electric cars?
The question is whether, the speculation is whether projections of future electricity, do they include electrification of transportation? And I simply don't know. It could be. I don't know. Questions, comments? If you think of other questions, yeah.
I know you talked about the water issue, having heard some groundwater experts in this area talk about water issues. I think the calculus is a little bit more complicated than, because if we have a finite amount of water
Yes.
that's used for electric power production, it can support the current projections, I believe, are the valley and the Snake River can support 1.5 million people with the other uses of water. Now you throw this in here of using water, that is going to affect, it has to affect some of those other issues. So I think once you get the groundwater people involved in this, then your litigation issues become greater than just the Snake River lines.
As I mentioned, I know of over the last 15, 20 years, at least 3 different power plant proposals in the state of Idaho because of water issues. So
I think that's
just from a historical perspective, you have to say, well, that's going to be an issue here too.
Yeah.
And
So if you know any groundwater people.
yeah. So they have to solve it. They either they solve it or they go home.
Correct.
And the problem is fairly
Lobbying
obvious.
groups always focus on their issue and not look at the bigger picture.
True.
Hey, well, if we have 1.5 million people here and we're still growing, so hey, everybody else can do it.
I'll record myself saying the following. If the people who are running this project aren't smart enough to find a solution to the water supply issue, I don't want them running the plant.
Fair, very fair.
Okay? This is not a deep, mysterious issue. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward issue. They solve it, they don't solve it. If they don't solve it, they aren't as competent as I think they are. Personal opinion. Anything else? I hope this has been interesting. Good discussion. I've taken some notes, and I'll send out the video when I get it uploaded to YouTube, assuming my camera works. Have a good afternoon.